What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I'm gonna continue with my top 10 point guards list. So if you remember, so far in this countdown, at number 10, I had Steve Nash. At number 9, I had Jason Kidd. At number 8, I had the often forgotten Walt Clyde Frazier. And at number 7, I had Bob Cousy. All right, so at number 6, I have none other than the glove, Gary Payton. All right. Gary Payton, if you remember him during his prime, was not only arguably the best point guard in the NBA during the mid to late 1990s. Generally, the consensus was he was the best point guard at that time. He was also probably maybe the most feared defensive player in the league during his prime. And that's very telling considering that he played in an era that also included guys like Shaquille O'Neal, David Robinson, Akeem Olajuwon, Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen. These guys were all first-rate defensive players. But Gary Payton was a terror. All right, John Stockton said that the only players that ever gave him consistent trouble, like one-on-one matchups, during his career at the point guard position were Magic Johnson and Gary Payton. So that's very lofty company for Gary Payton, you know what I'm saying? But the thing about Gary Payton, not only was he a great defensive player, but he was a great trash talker. And he was a master at psychological warfare. He got into people's heads. You know what I'm saying? He would get into some guy's head so badly that they would lose confidence out there on the court. They would let Gary Payton get to them. You know, certain guys that were known as, you know, great or at least confident scorers. Guys like, you know, John Starks could let Gary Payton get to him. You know, nobody was immune to Gary Payton, you know what I'm saying? But the thing about Gary Payton was he didn't come into the NBA gangbusters. He struggled a little bit, you know what I'm saying? He struggled a little bit, you know, especially on the offensive end. He was inconsistent. But Gary Payton worked on his game. And by the late 1990s, he was the best, late 1990s, early 2000s. He was the top scoring point guard in the NBA. And he willed himself into being a dangerous scorer at that position. Wasn't the greatest outside shooter. He didn't stretch the floor in that manner. But what Gary Payton did was, you know, he developed a pretty good mid-range game. He could post you up. He was very strong for a point guard. Even though he was 180 pounds, it was virtually all muscle. 6'4", which was a pretty decent-sized point guard in his era. He could knock down the three ball occasionally, but that wasn't a big part of his repertoire. You know, he's a guy that occasionally would go in the paint, you know, might shoot a runner. Wasn't afraid of contact. And like I said, he was strong. But it was on the defensive end where Gary Payton made his mark. You know, he was a great help defender. He was a great one-on-one defender. He stayed in front of his man. He had exceptionally quick hands. He was adept at getting steals both guarding you and in the passing lane, which is why he ranks so high among all-time, you know, steals lists. And he led the NBA in steals during the 95-96 season at a 2.9 points per game clip, which was also the same season that he won the Defensive Player of the Year award. And he's the only point guard to ever win that award. He's widely considered to be the greatest defensive point guard of all time. He was selected to the NBA All-Defensive First Team 9 different times, a record that he shares with 3 other players: Kevin Garnett, Michael Jordan, and Kobe Bryant. He was also a 9-time NBA All-Star and a 9-time All-NBA team member. And Gary Payton was born in Oakland, which has created a very notable crop of point guards, in particular, fellow top 10 list, alumni Jason Kidd. And he went to college at Oregon State from 1986 to 1990. And during his senior season, in 1989-1990, Gary Payton was featured on the cover story of Sports Illustrated as the nation's best college basketball player. He was a consensus All-American, a 3-time All-Pac-10 selection, and both the Pac-10 Defensive Player of the Year and Conference Freshman of the Year in 1987. He was the MVP of the Far West Classic Tournament 3 times. At the time of his graduation, Gary Payton held the school record for points, field goals, 3-point field goals, assists, and steals. And he holds all these records still to this day except for 3-point field goals. Gary Payton was the 2nd overall pick of the 1990 NBA draft by the Seattle Supersonics. And his first season was decent, but it wasn't overwhelming, as far as his numbers are concerned. His first NBA season, Gary Payton played in all 82 games, but only averaged 7.2 points and 6.4 assists, but he did average 2 steals per game. There was a notable game that occurred his rookie year, too, when the Chicago Bulls were playing the Sonics. I think they were in Seattle. And there was an incident that allegedly occurred between Michael Jordan and Gary Payton. Michael Jordan was supposedly in a club, and Gary Payton was at this club. Now, I think this was in Seattle. And Gary Payton did not back down from people. And Gary Payton was talking trash to Michael Jordan. And, he was just trash talking about how Jordan won't shit and he could shut him down or whatever. And in this particular game, I think the game before that in Chicago, I think Gary Payton had some success against Michael. So that is what brought this up. But in this particular game, I think Michael Jordan torched Gary Payton for like 46 points in 3 quarters before, he sat down because the game was a blowout or whatever. I think he said that in hindsight, he wanted to score at least 50 points on Gary Payton, but Phil took him out. But this was a younger Gary Payton, all right? That was a Jordan who was a little bit younger. Later on, as Gary Payton began to become a more intelligent basketball player, he knew how to not just physically shut somebody down, but what tactics would work better to slow a guy down. And everybody knows the performance that pretty much put Gary Payton on the map, which is, look, he did pretty much shut down Michael Jordan those last 3 games of the NBA Finals in '96. Even though the Bulls won 4 games to 2. And I'm a Bulls fan. And I'm I used to be a Jordan fanboy at one point in my life. I ain't gonna lie. But it can't be denied that Gary Payton did shut down Michael Jordan after Game 3 in that Finals. And and I'll get to that in a moment. But Gary Payton began to evolve as a player. He became more consistent. He began to develop a better offensive repertoire. And, by 1993, 1994, that's when you began to see the improvement in his game. All right. By 1993, 94, he was starting to become All NBA third team. He was starting to be named to all defensive teams, and his scoring average went up. His scoring average went up from 7.2 points per game his rookie year to 9.4 points to 13.5 points in 93 season. Now, in 94, he averaged 16.5 points per game. And at the same time, the Sonics were becoming a really good team. In 93-94, they won 63 games, although they were upset in the first round by the Denver Nuggets, who famously beat them in 5 back when the first round was a best-of-5 affair. But that Sonics team won 63 games, and that was a thing to come, man. Whenever you think of the Sonics in contemporary terms, you always think of, at least fans my age, you think of the Gary Payton, Shawn Kemp Sonics. They were very exciting to watch. It was very fun to watch Shawn Kemp play above the rim at that stage of his career, when he was only 230, 240, 250. When he could jump out of the gym, he was amazing to watch. And Gary Payton, even though he wasn't the greatest pure passer, he wasn't the greatest floor general per se, but he still racked up, assists. He still was a guy that averaged usually somewhere around 7.5 to about 8.5 assists per game. You know what I'm saying? So he still could rack up the assist totals. And another thing that made him, the thing that really made him a bigger threat was when he worked on his offense, because he wasn't just a one-dimensional defensive player. Then all of a sudden now this is a guy that's averaging close to 20 points a game. Now you got a guy that's averaging 18 points a game, 19 points a game, 20 points a game. Now you're a perennial all-star. Now you're a legitimate two-way player who's a threat on both ends of the court. And another thing too, man, Gary Payton made, along with Dennis Rodman, they made defense a thing that you wanted to do. You know what I'm saying? They made defense something that you could hold your head on with pride. Like in the mid-90s, like when I was in high school, at least as far as I'm concerned, I wanted to be like, I'm talking about the game, not like him per se, but I like guys like Dennis Rodman. I like guys like Gary Payton. I like guys like Latrell Sprewell. I like guys like, who else was known for their defense at that time? I'm not a huge guy, by height-wise anyway, so, the centers are centers, you know what I'm saying? They generally have, been known to be shot blockers and all that, but I like the guy that goes out there and plays his ass off and tries his best to shut down the next man, his man, and shut down the guy, or try his best to shut down the guy he's guarding. And I like the old NBA because not only did you see the physicality, but you saw the psychological warfare, guys talking trash to each other, and now it's largely absent. But look, I'd say from 1995 to about 2003, Gary Payton was the best point guard in the NBA. And that includes, guys like Stephon Marbury. That includes even Jason Kidd, in my opinion. And there were a lot of point guards at that time that were really good. Rod Strickland, Kenny Anderson, Mookie Blaylock, what's his name? Mark Price, Terrell Brandon. There were a lot of great point guards in that era. Who else was out there? Kevin Johnson. I think Kevin Johnson was the best point guard from like 91 to about 94, 95. Then I think for the next couple of years, I think Gary Payton took that mantle, but still had Kevin Johnson. You had Steve Nash, but he kind of developed later on. There were a lot of really, really good point guards in that era that get forgotten. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf is another one. A lot of them, Derek Harper, Mark Jackson, who some people think should be in the Hall of Fame, but I don't quite see a Hall of Famer. A lot of really, really good point guards at that time. Even Steve Smith started off his career as an all-star level point guard before he moved to the shooting guard position, then later on small forward. And then incredulously, the last year of his life, he actually started at power forward. Steve Smith started off as a point guard. Even B.J. Armstrong was a good point guard. He's the best point guard the championship Bulls era ever had. There's a lot. I mean, I know there's people I'm forgetting. Technically Dana Barros would be a point guard, I guess, even though he was a shooter. Allen Iverson started off as a point guard. So this notion that the 90s did not have, really good point guards is kind of bogus, you know what I'm saying? You see that from, I don't know, some people out there. But anyway, Gary Payton was, to me, the best of that era. And he did make his name during the 96 playoffs. You know what I'm saying? It was that playoff where he famously outplayed John Stockton. And in the finals, he made Michael Jordan's life hell. He hounded Jordan. The thing about Michael Jordan when he came back from retirement is he wasn't quite the same player. The reason why, in hindsight, I believe Mike switched up his game so much, why his game became more conservative, is because he didn't quite have the same energy that he had prior when he was in his 20s. Speaking from experience, man, when you get older, you just don't have the same energy that you had when you were a teenager and in your 20s. And that's why I think Mike's game became a lot more conservative. He didn't go to the hole as much. He became more of a mid-range shooter. And when you're a mid-range shooter, and occasionally outside and frequently drive to the hole, there are going to be some nights where you're going to shoot the lights out. But there are going to be some nights where you don't shoot the ball very well. And Mike had problems against Gary Payton because Gary Payton was physical. And Gary Payton, was the type of guy that, like I said, he was strong. He was 6'4", 180 pounds, and he could wear you out. And Mike was a very strong guard, but over the course of a series, those type of tactics can wear down on you. Now, if you remember the 1996 NBA Finals, initially George Karl did not want to put Gary Payton on Michael Jordan because he wanted to use Gary Payton more for his scoring prowess. At that time, Gary Payton was averaging better than 20 points a game, which was very, very high for a point guard in that era. That might have been one of the highest outside of Anthony Penny Hardaway, who was another point guard I forgot to mention earlier about in the 1990s. He wanted to utilize him more offensively. But when they went down that 3-0 hole, that rabbit hole, the 3-0, Gary Payton got in his face, put me on Mike. So while his offense was sacrificed, he, in the last 3 games, he probably only averaged like 16 rather than 22 or whatever it was he averaged. But at the same time, he did slow down Jordan. Mike, the first couple of games, was averaging 31 points a game on close to 50% shooting. But in the 3 games that Gary Payton was on him, his scoring plummeted to 23 points a game on less than 37% shooting from the floor, including only 5 of 19 in the Game 6 closeout. But it didn't matter much because the Bulls' overall team defense shut down the Sonics to the point where they only scored 75 points in that Game 6. And also when you play a guy defensively, it takes a lot of energy out of you, and therefore it does take away from your offense. That did hurt Gary Payton offensively. But it is what it is. But the thing is, people want to know is, what would have happened if Gary Payton had guarded Michael Jordan the entire series? I think that's a very interesting question. And it's possible, the Sonics might have pulled something out. It's possible. You like to think the Bulls would have made adjustments. I don't know. But there's one thing I will say. People like to talk about how Jordan didn't play anybody. It's a reason why that Sonics team won 64 games. And you can't really put it off to just expansion, because most of the expansion teams were in the Eastern Conference. The Raptors, the Magic, earlier on, a couple of years earlier, of course, the Hornets. Although by that time the Hornets were a pretty decent team. And you look how much competition there was in the Western Conference. You had the defending Rockets, who they swept in the first round that year. You had Utah, who were a really good team, perennial 50-game winners. You had, Charles Barkley Phoenix Suns, who were slipping but still were, I guess, what you would call contenders. You had Portland. You had, the Lakers. You still had all these different teams out there, and they won 64 games, which is still a franchise record. So that was a great team, man. Gary Payton would not go to another NBA Finals for 8 years, but the Sonics remained a top team in the NBA for a couple of more years, although they never made it to the NBA Finals again. Gary Payton just got better and better to the point where I believe it was 1 year in the early 2000s or so where Gary Payton was averaging 24 points a game, dishing out 8-9 assists per game. I mean, he was just a beast. He was the number one scorer at the point guard position in an era where bigs were still dominating, in the NBA. But, there was this thing, though. Look, many people will say that, look, Gary Payton was great, but he never won a championship in his prime. Now, he did win a championship in 2006. He was a big part of that team, but by that time, Gary Payton was a journeyman. But he did win a championship. But, Gary Payton, to me, was unfortunately, look, he was the product of organizations that made some bad decisions. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that John McLean signing was atrocious. There was this guy, there was this center named John McLean who was nothing special. You know what I'm saying? Bam Adebayo was way better than John McLean. Only thing John McLean was good for was a couple of blocks. He could not score. He wasn't really good at all. But the Sonics signed him to a huge contract, and knowing that Shawn Kemp was coming up, and they essentially traded Shawn Kemp, I think, after the 97 season. That broke up that team. That broke up what could have been, a championship team eventually, you know what I'm saying? That broke up that team. And the Sonics were a decent team afterward, but they never were a great team after 97 or so. Gary Payton still continued to put up numbers, but the championship window was over. And then he was part of a trade where he went to the Milwaukee Bucks, which was very unpopular. I hope this video isn't going too long, man. I'm just kind of just going through certain parts of his career. But there was a trade where George Karl had become, I think he was the coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. There was the big three with Sam Cassell, Glenn Big Dog Robinson, and Ray Allen. And it was that trade, I think, that sent Ray Allen to the Sonics in exchange for Gary Payton because, George Karl, number one, Gary Payton was his guy, and he wanted this team to revolve around defense, which is ridiculous because that team was known for its offense. That was his identity. You know what I'm saying? Plus, it was pretty much well known that Gary Payton was not going to stick around in Milwaukee. So exactly what happened, Gary Payton left town after 1 year. Matter of fact, I think it was half a season or something like that. Then Gary Payton went to the Boston Celtics and played, I think, 1 year. And then he went and joined the Lakers. But by this time, 2003, 2004, Gary Payton was finally on the downside of his career. He was diminishing as a player. And it was a team that was touted as a super team. It was Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, Karl Malone, and Gary Payton. And while Karl Malone and Gary Payton were not the same players they once were, they still had a lot of gas in the tank for their ages. But then Karl Malone, who had been a cyborg for 18 years, all of a sudden suffered a significant injury, and he was never the same. And Gary Payton just wasn't the same player anymore. He had slowed down a lot, especially on the defensive end. I remember actually seeing him get cooked by guys that 2 or 3 years earlier he would have shut down with ease. And they played the Detroit Pistons in the finals, and the Pistons famously, or if you're a Laker fan, infamously beat them in 5. All right. Afterward, Gary Payton was a journeyman. Pat Riley had been seeking the services of Gary Payton for years, and finally Gary Payton signed with the Miami Heat, and he was a part of that Miami Heat team, along with Wade, Shaq, Antoine Walker, Jason Williams. It was a great bunch of savvy veterans, and led by that young, vibrant Dwayne Wade when he was Flash, and they came back from that 2-0, almost 3-0 deficit to win that series 4-2. And Gary Payton finally got his elusive NBA championship. After the 2007 season, I think that was the year that the Heat were swept out of the playoffs by the Chicago Bulls, surprisingly. It was after that season that Gary Payton called it quits and announced his retirement. But Gary Payton, throughout his career, no doubt about it, he is a first ballot Hall of Famer, and he was a first ballot Hall of Famer. He was an NBA champion in 2006, 9-time NBA All-Star, as I mentioned earlier. Twice he was on All-NBA first team, 5 times on All-NBA second team, twice on the All-NBA third team. He was the reigning 95-96 Defensive Player of the Year winner, and he's the only point guard to win that award. 9 times, as I mentioned earlier, he was an NBA All-Defensive first team, and in 91 he was on the All-Rookie second team. He led the league in steals in 1995-96 at a rate of 2.85 steals per game. In college, he was consensus first-team All-American in 1990. Pac-10 Player of the Year in 1990. His number 20 is retired by the Oregon State Beavers, and he was the USA Basketball Male Athlete of the Year in 1999. His career averages are 16.3 points, 3.9 rebounds, and 6.7 assists. Now, keep in mind, he did play well into his, declining years, so those hurt his overall averages. Plus, he started off sort of slow in his career. But when you look at his cumulative numbers, they're more impressive. He had 21,813 points. This is a guy that wasn't a really good scorer starting off, but he still wound up with 21,813 points in that era and 8,966 assists. He won Olympic gold twice in 1996 in Atlanta and in 2000 in Sydney. I forgot to mention that. And he won the FIBA Americas Championship in 1999 in San Juan as a professional, in 1989 as an amateur before they changed the rules to allow professionals to play in these things. And he won the FIBA World Championship as an amateur in 1987. Gary Payton, one of the greatest point guards of all time. I got him number 6, man. Tell me what you guys think.